January 1945. A bitter wind sweeps across the snow-laden plains of upstate New York. Wooden barracks, rigid and uniform, huddled together like sentinels against the cold. Inside, German women prisoners of war move quietly, their breath visible in the frigid air. Frost clings to their hair and clothing as they shuffle through the narrow corridors, hands clasped to ward off the chill. Outside, the distant hum of an American town carries over the wire fences. Laughter, church bells, and the faint strains of radio music celebrating another step toward victory in Europe. Yet within the camp, the war feels both distant and immediate. Eyes watch every delivery, every visitor, every parcel with a mixture of suspicion and longing. Then, one morning, something extraordinary arrives. Neatly wrapped packages, unfamiliar handwriting, and small tokens from a world they thought had forgotten them. Surprise, curiosity, and disbelief ripple through the barracks. Some women hesitate, fingers brushing against paper and string as if unsure it is real. Others tear them open, revealing small comforts, chocolates, letters, knitted scarves. In that moment, the stark divide between enemy and human blurs. The war outside rages on, yet inside, an unexpected gesture sparks a quiet, fragile warmth. It is a moment that will ripple through their lives. One small act of kindness against the shadow of global conflict. By 1943, the United States held tens of thousands of German prisoners of war across more than 500 camps. While most of these camps housed men captured in North Africa or Europe, a smaller but significant number detained women. Unlike the male soldiers, the women prisoners, often young, often civilians caught in the sweep of the Wehrmacht, were transported across the Atlantic to the relative safety of inland America. Camps such as the ones in New York, Pennsylvania, and Minnesota were designed to be self-contained worlds. Rows of wooden barracks, surrounded by high fences and guarded watchtowers, contained kitchens, infirmaries, and work areas. Life inside these camps was regimented. Roll calls punctuated the day, barracks inspections maintained order and assigned labor. Laundry, sewing, agricultural work kept the prisoners occupied. For many women, these tasks were unfamiliar and exhausting, yet they provided structure and a sense of purpose. The Geneva Convention of 1929 guided the treatment of prisoners, requiring humane care, adequate food, and protection from violence. In practice, the U.S. Army followed these rules strictly, partly to maintain its own moral authority and partly to prevent unrest. Meals were simple but nourishing: oatmeal, potatoes, bread, occasional meat, and vegetables. Beds were sparse, yet dry and clean. Medical care, though basic, was available, and camp administrators often arranged small comforts within strict security protocols. Yet, despite relative safety, isolation weighed heavily. Many prisoners had not seen family in years. News from Europe was filtered, delayed, and often grim. Letters were rare, censored, and precious. The cold barracks, the regimented routines, and the omnipresent fence reinforced a sense of dislocation. Language barriers added another layer of distance, even as some prisoners were taught English for work or correspondence purposes. Amid this rigid order, American soldiers and officers developed varying attitudes toward their captives. Some were strictly by the book, viewing the prisoners as the enemy first and people second. Others, however, recognized the humanity in those under their watch. These officers often allowed small liberties, extra blankets during harsh winters, access to books, or brief walks under supervision. Their conduct set the tone for the daily lives of the women and would later influence how gestures from the outside world were received. By the winter of 1945, the war in Europe was nearing its end, yet uncertainty remained. Reports of battles, air raids, and shifting front lines filtered through the camps, often incompletely or with deliberate optimism. For the women, these fragments of news were a double-edged sword. Hope tempered by fear, relief tempered by guilt. They were prisoners of war, yet their minds remained firmly tethered to families, homes, and communities far away. This tension between confinement and longing created an emotional environment ripe for any human contact from the outside. Letters, packages, and simple signs of recognition became treasures, symbols that someone, somewhere, remembered them not as enemies, but as women, as humans. The arrival of parcels from American civilians would not merely break the monotony. It would challenge assumptions about the enemy, morality, and compassion. On the American home front, 1944 and 1945 were years of both relief and exhaustion. Victory in Europe seemed imminent, yet the toll of years of war, rationing, loss, and anxiety remained palpable. Civilians had become intimately involved in the war effort. Women ran factories, schools, and farms. Communities collected scrap metal and organized bond drives. And local organizations sought ways to assist soldiers and even prisoners of war. Among these efforts, a quieter, less heralded initiative began to take shape, sending aid to POWs. Civic organizations, churches, and women's groups coordinated small campaigns to provide care packages for German prisoners held in the United States. The rationale was both humanitarian and strategic. By treating prisoners humanely, Americans could demonstrate moral superiority and comply with international obligations. Yet for many volunteers, the effort was simply an act of conscience, a desire to acknowledge the shared humanity of those caught on the other side of the conflict. These packages were modest but meaningful. Letters with carefully penned words of goodwill, handmade knitted socks and scarves, chocolates, candies, and sometimes simple toiletries were gathered. Community members debated over what was permissible under U.S. Army regulations, mindful that nothing could be interpreted as contraband or aid to the enemy. Each parcel was inspected and approved before leaving the town, creating a delicate balance between generosity and caution. While male POWs received the bulk of these shipments, the arrival of packages for women prisoners was particularly impactful. For many of these women, who had been uprooted from homes and towns, the parcels represented a rare and tangible connection to the outside world. They were reminders that, even in captivity, they had not been forgotten. For some, the gifts were the first chocolates or treats they had tasted in months, the first words of kindness since leaving Europe. Historical records, including letters and camp reports, note the reactions vividly. Women would gather quietly around a single package, opening it with hands that trembled from both cold and anticipation. The simplest items, a knitted scarf, a small bar of soap, a letter signed by a stranger, could spark laughter, tears, or both. These reactions were observed not only by fellow prisoners, but also by camp staff, some of whom recorded their surprise at the intensity of the emotional response. The phenomenon also reflected the broader psychological climate. By 1945, the war had exhausted both sides. Civilians in the United States had grown accustomed to seeing the enemy as a distant threat rather than a living human being. Yet these acts of kindness forced a confrontation with reality. German prisoners were young women, frightened and displaced, deserving of basic dignity. The parcels became small instruments of empathy, quietly subverting the black and white narratives of wartime propaganda. Ultimately, the arrival of these gifts was not an isolated gesture, but the product of a larger network of effort, awareness, and moral choice. From the hands of American volunteers to the barracks of German women prisoners, these parcels carried more than food or clothing. They carried a question: what does it mean to show humanity in the midst of war? For the German women prisoners, the arrival of parcels was more than a material gift. It was a profound psychological moment. Diaries and letters preserved in camp archives reveal expressions of disbelief, curiosity, and quiet joy. One young prisoner, writing in January 1945, described unwrapping a small package containing chocolate and a knitted scarf. She wrote of an unfamiliar warmth, both in my hands and my chest, noting how the simple gesture momentarily displaced the weight of fear and isolation. These items became tokens of connection to a world outside barbed wire and armed guards. For many women, the parcels were carefully rationed, shared, and treasured, creating micro-rituals that punctuated the otherwise monotonous days of camp life. Camp commandants and officers played a crucial role in facilitating or regulating these acts of kindness. In official reports, some officers expressed skepticism or concern that gifts might be abused or could contravene security protocols. Others, however, recognized the morale-boosting effect on prisoners and the broader ethical statement it made about the United States. Brigadier General Julius Klein, overseeing POW administration in the Northeast, noted in a 1945 memorandum that allowing carefully vetted civilian parcels fosters compliance with the Geneva Convention and promotes good conduct among prisoners. Officers observed that prisoners who received parcels were more cooperative, less prone to conflict, and engaged more willingly in work assignments and camp activities. The act of sending gifts to the enemy carried profound moral weight. American civilians, many of whom had family members fighting in Europe, confronted a question at the heart of wartime ethics. Could kindness exist in the context of hostility? Letters preserved from volunteer committees reflect debates over what was appropriate to send. Some argued that only the bare necessities should be allowed, fearing that indulgence might undermine the war effort. Others emphasized compassion, citing religious or humanitarian principles. This tension illustrates a broader moral inquiry. Even in the midst of total war, empathy could persist, challenging binary notions of friend and foe. The parcels had measurable emotional impact on the prisoners. Psychologists studying POW behavior in 1945 noted that small external stimuli, letters, personal items, or food, could significantly reduce anxiety and depressive symptoms. Women who received gifts often displayed increased social interaction within the camp, shared belongings, and expressed gratitude openly. Anecdotal reports highlight moments of laughter, tears, and whispered conversations as packages were opened. In a setting dominated by routine and regulation, these parcels injected unpredictability, pleasure, and a fleeting sense of agency. While the parcels were small in size, their implications were broader than simple charity. American military officials recognized that humane treatment of POWs served strategic purposes. By ensuring German prisoners were treated with dignity, the United States projected moral authority, reinforcing its position in post-war negotiations and international perception. Moreover, the parcels helped maintain order within the camps. Prisoners who received regular, approved gifts were less likely to resist labor assignments, engage in conflict, or attempt escape. This tactical benefit reinforced a subtle but significant principle. Acts of kindness could serve both ethical and pragmatic ends. The delivery of packages required careful coordination. Civic organizations, religious groups, and local volunteers gathered, sorted, and packaged donations before sending them through the U.S. Army's POW mail system. Each item was screened for contraband, inspected for compliance with military regulations, and labeled for specific recipients. The process involved multiple levels of oversight, from volunteer collection points to base postal facilities, ensuring security while allowing personal items to reach prisoners. In many cases, packages crossed state lines, sometimes traveling hundreds of miles to reach inland camps, illustrating the logistical commitment behind what appeared to be simple acts of goodwill. For German military authorities and civilians back home, these parcels elicited mixed reactions. Some perceived them as small humiliations, a reminder that their soldiers and citizens were being treated as subjects of pity rather than as active participants in a proud war effort. Yet others saw the packages as proof of American adherence to international conventions, and in some cases, letters sent back to Germany carried a tone of astonishment and relief. Reports collected post-war indicate that some POWs shared news of the parcels with families, describing them as gestures that humanize the enemy and challenge preconceived notions about the opposing side. Beyond practical and political effects, the parcels fostered cultural exchange. Handwritten notes, small gifts reflective of American life, and locally crafted items offered prisoners glimpses into daily life beyond the barbed wire. Scarves knitted by volunteers in Pennsylvania or chocolates sent from New York carried the intangible weight of another society's care. For the women, these tokens were both comforting and educational, exposing them to the textures, tastes, and sentiments of a country that had been their adversary. Emotional bonds formed in these quiet moments often lasted well beyond the war, shaping post-war reflections and memoirs. March 1945. The snow had begun to thaw, leaving muddy paths between the barracks of a women's POW camp in upstate New York. It was early afternoon when the first large shipment of civilian packages arrived, stacked on a wooden cart outside the main gate. Guards opened the crates, revealing a collection of wrapped parcels, each bearing neat handwriting and familiar stamps from towns and cities across the United States. Inside the barracks, a ripple of anticipation spread. The women, who had spent months in quiet monotony, now gathered around the crates with a mixture of skepticism and hope. The first parcel to be opened contained chocolate, a pair of knitted socks, and a small handwritten letter wishing them health and courage. A woman in her early 20s gasped, her eyes widening as she read the note aloud in German, translating the sentiment for others. For many, it was the first time in months that the outside world had reached them in such a direct and personal way. Camp records from the day described the scene vividly. Prisoners seated on their bunks, eagerly opening parcels, laughter and tears intermingling, a sense of human connection prevailing over the isolation of confinement. Officers observed quietly from a distance, noting the sudden lift in morale. The women shared chocolate among themselves, admired the scarves, and carefully pinned letters above their bunks. A small cultural shift occurred almost imperceptibly. The barracks were filled not with fear or suspicion, but with curiosity and gratitude. The arrival of the parcels also prompted informal social gatherings within the camp. Women compared gifts, exchanged letters, and even created small reading circles to enjoy the letters together. The simple act of sharing sparked conversation and camaraderie, reducing the pervasive sense of loneliness that had dominated daily life. Reports indicate that these moments of connection contributed to improved compliance with camp routines, fewer disciplinary issues, and a more cooperative atmosphere overall. News of the shipments traveled quickly among the prisoners. In later correspondence, several women described the astonishment and warmth they felt, emphasizing that the packages were more than gifts. They were reminders of a shared humanity. Some wrote letters back to the organizations that sent the parcels, expressing gratitude despite the limitations of wartime mail. These correspondences became part of the historical record, offering a rare glimpse into the emotional lives of German women prisoners and a surprising power of kindness to bridge divides. The impact extended beyond individual morale. For the first time, American officers began to recognize the broader implications of civilian involvement. Camp commanders allowed larger parcels, longer recreational periods during deliveries, and even small events where prisoners could gather to open packages collectively. The initial skepticism of both officers and volunteers gave way to acknowledgement. These gestures were reshaping the daily experience of imprisonment in measurable ways. Amidst the quiet of the barracks, a subtle but profound transformation was underway. The parcels, small in size but immense in emotional weight, were breaking down barriers. The prisoners, long accustomed to fear, monotony, and uncertainty, were now participants in a narrative of shared humanity, a narrative that would reverberate far beyond the walls of the camp. By late spring 1945, the phenomenon of civilian packages had become a regular rhythm in the women's POW camps. News of the parcel's arrival spread quickly, not only among prisoners but also among staff, reinforcing the unspoken understanding that these gestures carried meaning far beyond their material value. Each new shipment reignited the quiet excitement within the barracks, moments that became embedded in daily life as rituals of anticipation and shared experience. One particularly notable shipment arrived in May, containing dozens of letters from school children, small handcrafted toys, and baked goods wrapped in wax paper. Prisoners gathered around the parcels, reading the letters aloud in German. The messages varied in tone. Some expressed curiosity about life in Germany. Others offered simple encouragement, and a few acknowledged the war itself with cautious empathy. For many of the women, these letters were the first acknowledgement of individuality from Americans who had no obligation to reach out. The emotional resonance was profound, evoking tears, laughter, and whispered conversations among the prisoners. Camp officers observed that these deliveries influenced behavior in tangible ways. Prisoners who previously displayed withdrawal or irritability became more engaged in communal activities. Work assignments, previously met with reluctance, were approached with greater cooperation. Reports from the time note that morale improvements were measurable. Incidents of conflict decreased, and the atmosphere shifted from one of tension to tentative openness. The officers, initially skeptical of civilian involvement, began documenting these effects, recognizing that kindness, even from perceived enemies, could alter human behavior. Letters sent back to Germany amplified the impact beyond the camps. Families reading the messages were astonished by the gestures of goodwill from the United States. For many, the idea that American civilians had taken time to write, knit, and bake for prisoners seemed inconceivable. Some mothers and sisters of the prisoners interpreted these gestures as proof of an underlying decency in the enemy, challenging wartime narratives of absolute hostility. The ripple effect of empathy was extending across oceans, subtly reshaping perceptions of the enemy in both camps and civilian homes. By mid-1945, the final weeks before the war's end in Europe intensified the significance of these parcels. News of Germany's surrender in May was filtered through camp channels, mingling with the anticipation and excitement of ongoing shipments. Prisoners reflected on the paradox. While the war had inflicted immense suffering, small acts of humanity had persisted, quietly transforming the emotional landscape of captivity. Some women documented these experiences in diaries, noting that the gifts reminded us we were still human, still seen, still remembered. These moments, mundane yet extraordinary, represented a turning point in the lived experience of German women prisoners. The war outside remained relentless, yet inside the camp, the arrival of parcels had created a fragile but enduring bridge between former enemies. For the prisoners, it was a tangible affirmation that kindness could survive even amidst conflict, an experience that would leave lasting impressions well beyond their years in captivity. The immediate aftermath of the parcel's arrival was evident in the daily rhythm of the camps. Officers' reports from mid-1945 consistently noted a measurable improvement in prisoner morale. Women who had previously been withdrawn or silent became more communicative, sharing letters and small gifts among themselves. Meals were consumed with a renewed sense of community, and work assignments, once met with reluctance, were approached more willingly. The parcels had created a subtle yet profound shift in behavior, proving that even minor gestures could influence the human psyche under the strain of captivity. Beyond the camps themselves, these acts of kindness reached the American public. Local newspapers occasionally reported on civilian efforts to send packages, framing them as examples of moral leadership and humane treatment. Letters from volunteers highlighted their own sense of connection to the prisoners, and the feedback from camp administrators affirmed the tangible benefits of their efforts. The interaction became a quiet but effective form of cultural diplomacy, demonstrating American values of compassion and adherence to international law. Among the prisoners, the effects were equally significant. Diaries and memoirs collected after the war described the emotional resonance of the parcels long after they were received. Women recalled the smell of chocolates, the warmth of knitted scarves, and the sincerity of handwritten letters as moments that punctuated months of monotony and anxiety. For many, these small gifts were more than mere objects. They were symbols of recognition, proof that the world outside had not forgotten them. Even as the war in Europe concluded in May 1945, the parcels continued to arrive, carrying with them a sense of continuity and care. In some cases, women prisoners began corresponding directly with the civilians who had sent gifts, establishing lines of communication that bridged wartime divides. These connections were not merely sentimental. They fostered an awareness of shared humanity, offering a counterpoint to the adversarial narratives that had dominated for years. The combination of improved morale, behavioral compliance, and cross-cultural understanding highlighted the broader significance of what might have seemed like minor acts. The parcels, though small in scale, exemplified a philosophy that extended beyond the immediate context of captivity, that empathy, generosity, and recognition could have tangible, transformative effects even in the midst of war. The long-term effects of these gestures extended far beyond the immediate environment of the camps. Historical analyses conducted after the war noted that German women prisoners who had received civilian parcels demonstrated higher levels of psychological resilience compared to those who had not. Diaries and post-war interviews reveal that many of these women retained vivid memories of the gifts, describing them as moments that sustained hope and preserved dignity during months of uncertainty. These experiences shaped their reflections on captivity and, for some, influenced their attitudes toward Americans in the post-war period. For the American volunteers, the act of sending parcels also carried lasting significance. Women's groups, church committees, and civic organizations documented the process meticulously, reporting both the challenges and rewards of reaching out to enemy prisoners. These efforts fostered a sense of participation in the broader moral dimension of the war, illustrating that civilians could contribute not only materially, but ethically. Some volunteers later corresponded with former prisoners, maintaining relationships that transcended national and cultural boundaries, a testament to the enduring impact of compassion. Official military and government reports acknowledged the practical benefits of these gestures as well. Commanders cited improved cooperation, reduced disciplinary incidents, and smoother camp operations. International observers took note of the humane treatment of prisoners in U.S. camps, which contrasted sharply with reports of mistreatment elsewhere. This favorable perception strengthened the United States' post-war moral and political standing, demonstrating that ethical conduct in wartime could serve strategic interests. The parcels also left a mark on historical memory. Memoirs, scholarly articles, and oral histories collected decades later frequently reference the emotional resonance of the gifts, framing them as symbols of empathy amidst conflict. Former prisoners often recalled the surprise, gratitude, and small but meaningful moments of joy they brought. These recollections contributed to a broader understanding of the war's human dimension, emphasizing that the experiences of prisoners, particularly women, were shaped not only by deprivation and discipline, but also by unexpected acts of kindness. Ultimately, the story of these parcels illustrates a dual legacy. Practically, they improve conditions and behavior within the camps. Emotionally and culturally, They challenged the rigid boundaries of enmity, creating bridges of understanding that persisted long after the fences were dismantled. In a war defined by violence, scarcity, and fear, these simple packages stood as enduring reminders of the capacity for human connection, even between former adversaries. The story of German women POWs receiving gifts from American civilians stands as a quiet testament to the persistence of humanity in the darkest of times. In a world dominated by orders, barbed wire, and conflict, small gestures, letters, knitted scarves, chocolates, revealed the enduring power of empathy. These acts did not change the course of battles or alter strategic outcomes, yet they reshaped the lived experience of captivity, offering moments of comfort, dignity, and recognition. For the women who received them, the parcels were tangible reminders that they were more than prisoners. They were individuals, remembered by strangers who saw beyond nationality or wartime allegiance. For the American volunteers, they were exercises in conscience, moral courage, and civic responsibility, demonstrating that even in war, ordinary people could enact extraordinary acts of kindness. Historically, these interactions challenge the conventional narratives of enmity. They remind us that war, while destructive, does not extinguish the human capacity for compassion. The parcels served as bridges across cultural, national, and emotional divides, creating connections that endured long after the surrender of Germany and the dismantling of the camps. In the end, the story of these gifts is not merely about chocolates or letters. It is about the fragility and resilience of humanity, the potential for understanding amidst conflict, and the enduring lesson that kindness, even small, seemingly insignificant gestures, can leave a lasting imprint on history. In the quiet barracks of 1945, behind fences and watchtowers, these parcels prove that empathy survives even in war, shaping lives, perceptions, and the moral landscape of the future.